The projection screen was still glowing, with the critical safety defects I had uncovered when all 14 executives stood up in unison. Their faces were twisted in anger as they pushed back their heavy leather chairs. My voice died mid-sentence, right as I was showing the slide on the systematic testing failures of our flagship diagnostic equipment. Walter Vance, our chief operating officer, stared at me from across the long mahogany table, his eyes cold and dismissive. He was a man accustomed to having the final word in every room, and he did not hide his contempt. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, leaned forward, and announced to the room that they were done listening to my reports. He called it a waste of valuable company time. The sound of shuffling paper and the zip of leather portfolios filled the room as the other executives followed his lead. None of them looked at me. It was a silent, orchestrated rejection designed to humiliate me, to make me feel small. I stood there, my hand still holding the laser pointer, aiming at a graph that proved our product defects had risen by 40% over the past year. Diana Croft, the vice president of operations, offered a tight plastic smile as she walked toward the double doors. She told me I should consider whether I was truly cut out for this level of corporate responsibility. They moved out of the boardroom in a tight pack, their leather shoes clicking loudly on the polished oak floor. The CFO, Gary Stone, was the last to leave. He paused by the doorway, his hand resting near the light switch. He looked at me in the dim room, shook his head, and told me not to bother finishing my speech because nobody would ever read my report. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he flicked the light switch, plunging the boardroom into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the cold blue glow of my projector. I sat in the dimmed room for 45 seconds, listening to the hum of the cooling fan in the projector. The silence that followed their departure was heavy, almost suffocating, but it did not make me panic. Instead, it brought a strange sense of clarity. My name is Donald Miller, and I am 54 years old. Until that very afternoon, I was the Director of Quality Assurance at Nexus Diagnostics, one of the nation's premier manufacturers of clinical imaging and diagnostic equipment. Our machines are used in hundreds of hospitals and diagnostic clinics across the country. They are the systems doctors rely on to detect serious illnesses early, and the systems patients trust with their lives. I have spent 28 years in this industry, and my reputation was built on absolute thoroughness. I grew up in a small manufacturing town where honesty was not just a word, it was a way of survival. My father had spent 30 years working the assembly line at a local valve plant. When that plant was shut down after a preventable pressure valve failure that the management had deliberately hidden, it ruined our community. Many families lost everything, and several workers were severely injured. I promised myself then that I would never stay silent if I uncovered defects that could endanger human lives. That was the reputation that brought me to Nexus Diagnostics. 5 months ago, when Walter Vance recruited me, he told me they needed someone with my absolute integrity to audit their processes. He spoke of fresh eyes and minor inefficiencies that needed to be ironed out. But the reality was far different. My predecessor, Timothy Brooks, had left the company suddenly under what the board claimed were medical circumstances. The quality assurance team was nervous whenever I asked about him. His files had been wiped, and his staff was tight-lipped. But I soon noticed that something was deeply wrong in the testing logs. Machines that had failed their final safety validation checks were somehow marked as approved and shipped out. The quality technician, Nancy Cooper, would sweat whenever I asked her about the validation database. She kept looking at the security cameras in the laboratory, terrified that we were being watched. It was clear that she knew something, but was too terrified of losing her livelihood to speak out. I began to investigate after hours, bypassing the company's servers and downloading raw sensor logs directly from the assembly line controllers. The patterns were shocking. Our flagship medical imaging line had critical diagnostic defects that were being deliberately concealed by the plant management. Testing protocols had been modified to mask critical sensor lag, which could lead to missed tumors in patients. When I first raised these concerns in a private memo to Diana Croft, she brushed them off. She told me that every complex machine has an acceptable margin of error, and that I was focusing on theoretical risks rather than practical operations. But when I refused to drop the matter, she slid a folder across her mahogany desk. Inside was a revised employment contract offering me a salary increase of $50,000 and a strict confidentiality clause. She patted my shoulder and told me that Nexus Diagnostics rewards loyal team players who understand the bigger picture. I took the folder, told her I needed time to review it, and went back to my office. That very evening, I received an anonymous message containing a copy of a suppressed safety report from last year. It was the report Timothy Brooks had compiled before his sudden disappearance. The message was brief, stating that Timothy was not sick, but had been forced out because he refused to sign off on the defective machines. The next morning, as I walked to my car in the quiet parking garage, Nancy Cooper was waiting for me in the shadow of the concrete pillar. She was visibly trembling, looking around as if she expected someone to jump out from behind the parked cars. She whispered that the executive team was setting me up. She said, Walter Vance already had my termination paperwork signed and waiting on his desk. And they had told everyone my upcoming presentation was nothing but an exaggeration by a disgruntled new hire who could not handle the pressure. I asked her why she was risking her job to tell me this. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said it was because Timothy Brooks had tried to do the right thing too, and he did not deserve what they did to him. After she walked away, I stood by my car, the cold air filling my lungs. Her warning did not frighten me. It gave me the exact piece of the puzzle I needed. I went back to my office and made one final modification to my presentation, removing the most damning slides that detailed the financial connection to the cover-up. I saved those for another purpose, knowing they would be my ultimate leverage when the time came. The information that Nancy Cooper shared with me in the cold parking garage was the catalyst that changed my entire approach. I realized that a standard corporate escalation would never work against a unified front of corrupt executives. They had the legal team, the public relations firm, and the board members in their pockets. A simple whistleblower report would be buried, and I would be escorted out of the building. My name dragged through the mud. I needed to build an airtight case that could not be silenced by high-priced corporate attorneys. I began my deep dive into the encrypted archives that Timothy Brooks had left behind. I discovered that before he was forced out, Timothy had set up a secure digital vault on an external cloud server. He had programmed a digital dead man switch, which would automatically release the files to regulatory agencies if he did not log in once a month. However, the executives had discovered the existence of this switch and had threatened him with criminal prosecution for corporate espionage, unless he handed over the decryption keys and signed a gag order. They paid him a massive settlement from an offshore shell account, which they then used as leverage to keep him silent. But Timothy had been clever. He had not given them all the keys. He had left a hidden door in the system, and the anonymous email I received contained the instructions on how to access it. For the next 12 weeks, I worked 2 jobs. By day, I was the compliant director of quality assurance, attending meetings and pretending to consider the lucrative contract extension Diana Croft had offered. By night, I became a detective, cross-referencing Timothy's files with the current production logs. What I uncovered was even worse than what Timothy had found. The safety deviations were not just errors. They were part of a systematic cost-cutting measure designed to boost quarterly profit margins by 15%. By using cheaper, uncertified sensors in our diagnostic machines, the company saved millions of dollars while directly increasing the failure rate of the imaging software. The documentation showed that the executive team had explicitly calculated the cost of potential lawsuits versus the profit of using the cheaper parts, and had decided that the risk was worth the financial reward. This was a clear violation of federal laws governing medical equipment safety. I knew I could not go to the internal legal department. Instead, I reached out to Elizabeth Foster, the lead investigator at the federal agency that oversaw medical equipment safety. Our first conversation was held on a secure line. She was initially skeptical, explaining that they had investigated Nexus Diagnostics in the past, but had always run into a wall of high-priced attorneys and clean paperwork. But when I showed her the raw sensor logs and the evidence of altered validation signatures, her tone changed. She told me that Timothy Brooks had stopped responding to their inquiries 5 months ago, and the company had claimed he was on extended medical leave. I told her the truth about Timothy's forced retirement and the gag order. From that moment, Elizabeth and I became partners in a quiet crusade. We knew we needed the executives to make a public, undeniable statement of their knowledge and intent. We needed them to reject the safety warnings on record, showing that their actions were deliberate. We planned the strategy meeting as the trap. I would present the general quality failures, and we would document their response. The walkout was exactly what we anticipated. They believed their collective authority was absolute, that by walking out they could simply erase the problem. But they did not know that every word spoken in that room was recorded, and that Elizabeth Foster's team was already waiting in the lobby. To ensure the trap was set perfectly, I had to ensure that every technical aspect of my report was absolutely flawless. I spent hours verifying the sensor specifications, documenting how the cheaper, uncertified units would fail to register critical anomalies during high-speed scans. This meant that patients could undergo diagnostic procedures and receive clean bills of health, when in reality, life-threatening conditions were developing undetected. When I documented these specific findings, my heart sank. It was no longer a theoretical debate about margins of error. It was a matter of life and death. The calculation sheets I found in the executives' private folders showed that they had estimated the cost of paying out wrongful death settlements would be cheaper than recalling the thousands of units already shipped to hospitals. It was a level of corporate sociopathy that I had never encountered in my 28 years of professional practice. The evidence was damning, and I knew that once the regulators saw it, there would be no way for the executives to spin the narrative. I remember the final phone call I had with Elizabeth the night before the presentation. We went over the plan one last time. She assured me that her team was fully prepared to move the moment the walkout occurred. She explained that they had secured the necessary warrants from a federal judge, but they needed the executives to actively demonstrate their intent to suppress the safety warnings to make the case completely bulletproof. The walkout would be the final, crucial link. Knowing that the federal agents would be waiting downstairs gave me the courage to stand in that boardroom and face the hostile audience. I was not just presenting a report. I was initiating the downfall of a corrupt regime that had put profits over human lives for far too long. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Gary Stone, the silence of the boardroom felt heavy. The blue light from the projector screen cast long, distorted shadows across the empty chairs. I stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. The walkout had been a theatrical display of corporate arrogance, but it was also the final piece of evidence we needed. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had committed to memory. Elizabeth Foster answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp and alert. I spoke the 8 words that we had agreed upon. They walked out, just as we planned. Elizabeth let out a quiet breath. She asked if they had made the comments about the Baltimore incident. I confirmed that Gary Stone and Diana Croft had both dismissed the reports on the record, with Walter Vance claiming that the customer complaints were merely user errors. "Excellent," she said, her keyboard clicking in the background. "That establishes their direct knowledge of the previous failures and their decision to ignore them. Stay in your office and act as if nothing has changed." We are entering the building now. I turned off the projector, gathered my tablet, and walked back to my office. The hallways were quiet, but the air felt charged with tension. The administrative assistants avoided looking at me as I passed. Word of the executive walkout had already spread through the building, and to them, I was a dead man walking. I sat at my desk and waited. I looked at the small black recording device that I had kept hidden in my pen holder for the past 12 weeks. It had captured every conversation that had taken place in this office, including the meetings where Diana Croft had tried to bribe me with the $50,000 contract increase. I slipped the device into my jacket pocket, feeling its weight. I knew that within minutes the counterattack would begin. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, my office door swung open. Diana Croft walked in, her face expressionless. She did not bother to sit down. She stood by the desk, leaning against the edge, and told me that my employment with Nexus Diagnostics was terminated, effective immediately. She handed me a white envelope containing my official termination papers, signed by Walter Vance. She said security would be at my door in 20 minutes to escort me out of the building. She demanded that I leave my laptop, my phone, and all my research files on the desk, claiming that everything I had worked on was the exclusive property of the company. I looked at her, keeping my expression neutral, and asked if my personal notes were also considered company property. She narrowed her eyes and said everything stayed. She told me that I had made enemies of people who had immense influence in this industry, and that my career in quality assurance was officially over. She said nobody would believe the word of a single disgruntled employee over the unanimous decision of the entire executive board. I nodded slowly, pretending to be defeated. I told her that principles did not seem to mean much against the opinion of 14 executives. She smiled her cold, toothless smile, told me she was glad I finally understood the reality of the situation, and walked out, leaving the door open. As I packed the few personal items I had in my desk, I felt a strange sense of relief. The files they thought they were seizing from my computer were already backed up on Elizabeth Foster's secure server, along with the 12 weeks of audio recordings. The physical papers I left on the desk were nothing but duplicates. I looked around my office one last time, remembering Timothy Brooks and the warning Nancy Cooper had given me. They had thought they could handle me the same way they handled Timothy, through intimidation and legal threats. But they had underestimated my willingness to lose my job to protect the patients, who relied on our machines. I zipped my briefcase and walked out into the main corridor, ready to face whatever came next. The walk to the lobby felt longer than usual. The employees I passed were whispering, their eyes darting toward me and then away. Some looked at me with pity, believing that I had just destroyed my career. Others looked at me with fear, wondering if the company itself would survive the scandal that was about to unfold. I kept my head high, walking past the rows of cubicles where engineers and technicians were working on the very machines I had spent months auditing. I knew that their jobs and the future of the company were now in the hands of the regulators. As I reached the reception desk, the glass elevator doors opened, and the 5 federal agents stepped out, their dark suits and formal badges creating an immediate hush in the lobby. The receptionist froze, her hand hovering over her telephone, as Elizabeth Foster stepped forward to execute the warrants. The sight of federal agents systematically securing the executive suite was a stark contrast to the quiet humiliation I had experienced in the boardroom just an hour earlier. Walter Vance emerged from his office, his face flushed red with anger. He strode toward Elizabeth Foster, demanding to see the warrant and threatening to call the agency's director. But Elizabeth remained completely calm, presenting the legal documents with clinical precision. Her agents were already placing security seals on the server room doors and instructing the IT staff to step away from their keyboards. Walter Vance then spotted me standing by the elevator. He walked over, his eyes wide with fury, and whispered that this little stunt would destroy my career and that the company's legal department would sue me for everything I owned. He reminded me of the confidentiality agreements I had signed when I joined the company. I looked at him and replied that I had not shared any proprietary information with competitors or the public. I had simply followed the mandatory reporting protocols required by federal law for medical device safety violations. I told him that under Title 21 of the United States Code, Section 331, the falsification of quality records for Class II medical diagnostic equipment was a federal crime, and that any confidentiality agreement attempting to conceal such criminal acts was legally void as against public policy. The color drained from his face as he realized the legal trap he was in. Before Walter could respond, Elizabeth Foster walked over and informed him that I would be staying to assist their team in identifying the specific test databases that had been altered. She told him that his presence was required in the main conference room for questioning. For the next 5 hours, the Nexus Diagnostics headquarters became a crime scene. The executives were isolated in separate offices, prevented from communicating with one another. I sat in a conference room with Elizabeth and 2 agents, pointing them toward the exact directories and encrypted folders where the altered validation reports were stored. We showed them the direct correlation between the dates of the safety overrides and the dates of the offshore bonus payments to the executives. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the CFO, Gary Stone, was escorted out of the building by federal agents. He looked 10 years older, his head bowed, refusing to look at the employees who lined the hallways. By 4:15, 10 more executives followed him out of the building. They were not in handcuffs, but it was clear to everyone that they were no longer in control. Walter Vance walked past the glass walls of the conference room where I was sitting. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The realization that the man they had dismissed and tried to humiliate had systematically dismantled their entire operation was written all over his face. But as I watched him leave, I knew that this was only the first phase. The evidence we had secured today was only part of the puzzle. The true climax would occur the following morning at the emergency board meeting. The board members had been summoned for a 9 a.m. assembly to address the regulatory crisis, and I had been invited by the board chair, Ronald Barrett, to present the findings directly to them. That night, I did not sleep. The weight of the past 5 months felt heavy on my shoulders, but my mind was clear. I spent the hours organizing the files that Timothy Brooks had left behind, ensuring that every claim I made was backed by multiple sources of digital evidence. I knew that the executive's defense would be to claim that the quality failures were the work of a few rogue technicians and that the leadership team had no knowledge of them. But I had the emails, the signature approvals, and the financial records that proved otherwise. I had the evidence that would show the board that the corruption went all the way to the top. The process of sorting through Timothy's encrypted records was tedious, but it revealed the true depth of the conspiracy. I found email correspondence stretching back over 2 years, where Walter Vance and Diana Croft discussed the implementation of the cheaper sensors. In one exchange, Diana explicitly stated that the probability of a critical scan failure was low enough to justify the savings, even if a few diagnostic errors occurred. They had treated human lives as variables in a profit equation. I also uncovered evidence of how they had systematically silenced Timothy, threatening to ruin his reputation in the industry by fabricating allegations of intellectual property theft. If he did not sign the non-disclosure agreement, it was the same playbook they had tried to use on me, but they had not anticipated that I would cooperate with the federal authorities from the very beginning. By the time the sun began to rise, I had compiled a comprehensive digital dossier that left no room for doubt or denial. The morning sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across the Nexus Diagnostics building. As I arrived at the executive entrance, I noticed the news vans parked along the street, their reporters waiting for any scrap of information. The news of the federal raid had already leaked, and the company's stock was preparing for a major drop. I walked up to the executive floor, which was now guarded by independent security officers hired by the board. Ronald Barrett's assistant, Chloe, met me at the elevator and led me to the small anteroom adjacent to the main boardroom. She whispered that the board members had been arguing since 7 in the morning and that the atmosphere inside was incredibly tense. At exactly 9 in the morning, the boardroom doors opened and Ronald Barrett, the silver-haired board chair, invited me in. The room was filled with 27 people, including the 14 board members, senior legal counsel, and the remaining department heads who had not been involved in the cover-up. The seats usually occupied by Walter Vance, Diana Croft, and Gary Stone were empty. Ronald Barrett introduced me and explained that the board had suspended the termination papers filed against me the previous day. He asked me to present the findings that had triggered the federal investigation. I connected my tablet and began my presentation. For the next 50 minutes, I methodically laid out the evidence. I showed them the original test results side by side with the falsified records that had been uploaded to the federal database. I showed them the documentation of the 5 separate hospital patients who had suffered serious diagnostic complications. Because our machines had failed to detect their conditions, failures that had been flagged by our testing lab but overridden by the operations team. The board members sat in stunned silence as the scale of the liability became clear. I then presented the financial records from Timothy Brooks' encrypted vault, tracing the payments from our offshore accounts directly to the personal accounts of Walter Vance, Diana Croft, and Gary Stone. Finally, I played the audio recording of the executives walking out of my presentation the day before, including Walter Vance's comment that they were listening. They were done listening to my reports. The presentation was the final blow. The legal counsel advised the board that the company faced massive criminal and civil liability, and that the only way to save the organization was to cooperate fully with the federal prosecutors and terminate all involved executives for cause. By 12:30 in the afternoon, trading of the company's stock was officially suspended after a 55% drop. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the board announced the immediate termination of Walter Vance, Diana Croft, Gary Stone, and 9 other executives. By 3:30 in the afternoon, federal prosecutors announced formal indictments against the core leadership team for conspiracy, wire fraud, and violations of the Medical Device Safety Acts. As the meeting adjourned, Ronald Barrett asked me to stay behind. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and exhaustion and told me that I had been planning this for a long time. I confirmed that I had been building the case since my 3rd week at the company when I realized that the corruption was systemic. He asked if I would stay on to help rebuild the quality assurance department as the new vice president. I looked around the boardroom at the empty chairs and the expensive mahogany table. I told him that my work here was done and that I would be submitting my formal resignation the following morning. I explained that I had accomplished what I set out to do, which was to ensure that the truth was revealed and that the patients using our equipment were safe. The next day, I sat in my apartment, watching the news coverage of the executives being escorted to their arraignments. My phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Dr. Campbell, the head of the Medical Safety Board at Memorial Hospital. He said they had been following the news about Nexus Diagnostics and were incredibly impressed by my commitment to safety. He asked if I would be interested in a consulting position to help their hospital group audit and identify compromised diagnostic equipment. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lift from my shoulders. I told him I was very interested. Sometimes, the best revenge is not watching your enemies fall. It is using the ruins they left behind to build something better and safer for the world. If you have followed this journey to the end, I want to thank you for listening. Standing up against powerful corporate forces takes courage, but knowing that the truth will always prevail makes the fight worth it. Please hit the like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more accounts of justice. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, no amount of corporate power can withstand the weight of truth when it is finally set free.